It started as quietly as any other morning in the neighborhood. The sun rose over the rows of manicured lawns, and the faint hum of sprinklers filled the air. But for Marcus, a black homeowner who had lived in the community for nearly a decade, mornings had taken on a different tone. Every sunrise brought with it the uneasy anticipation of another confrontation with the HOA. Marcus had worked hard to buy his home, a 2-story brick house with a porch he built himself, a backyard garden. He maintained with care and a sturdy fence that wrapped around his property like armor. That fence wasn't just wood and steel. It was a boundary, a declaration that what was his could not be touched. But to the HOA patrol, led by a woman named Brenda, it was a symbol of defiance. Brenda was the type who wore authority like a badge. She strutted around the neighborhood with her clipboard and reflective vest, treating every crack in the sidewalk and every slightly overgrown bush like it was a personal offense against her reign. And Marcus's fence, that was her obsession. She claimed it violated community uniformity standards, though Marcus had the permits to prove otherwise. He had installed it legally, inspected by the city, approved in writing. Still, Brenda's crusade against it never slowed. The first time she confronted him, she demanded he take it down. He ignored her, knowing she had no legal ground. The second time she called the police, but the officer only shrugged after Marcus handed him his paperwork. The third time, Brenda herself trespassed, climbing over the fence as though she was storming enemy territory. Marcus caught her that day, yelling at him from inside his own yard, as if she were the rightful enforcer of rules that didn't exist. That should have been enough humiliation for her, but it wasn't. Weeks later, she came back, and this time, she didn't bother with warnings, letters, or fines. She came with the same arrogant smirk, gloves on her hands, and the same determination to prove she had power. Marcus saw her from his porch. He didn't move, didn't shout, didn't warn her. He only leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee, watching her drag her foot onto the first rung of the fence. It was then he realized the HOA wasn't going to stop. Brenda wasn't going to stop. If he wanted peace, he would have to take matters into his own hands. So he began to plan. He studied his fence, tested the wiring he had discreetly run along its metal framework. He had installed it initially as a deterrent for raccoons that kept breaking into his garden, but now it had a new purpose. With a few modifications, a transformer here, an insulated switch there, Marcus had turned his fence into something more than just a boundary. It was protection. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years, the HOA had treated him like he didn't belong in the neighborhood. They nitpicked his lawn, his paint colors, his driveway. They acted as though he were an intruder in his own home. And now it was Brenda, the self-appointed patrol, who was about to learn what it meant to cross a line. That morning, when she returned yet again, clipboard in hand, her eyes locked on the fence like a predator circling prey. Marcus sat calmly on his porch, his finger resting lightly on the hidden switch that controlled the current. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the fence, ready to haul herself over, determined to invade his property once more. The sparks crackled. She yelped and stumbled backward, clutching her hand, glaring up at the fence as though it had betrayed her. The look of shock, confusion, and rage spread across her face, and Marcus couldn't help but smirk. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was about principle. But Marcus knew this was only the beginning. Brenda wasn't the type to back down after being embarrassed. The HOA wasn't the type to admit defeat. And as he sat on that porch, sipping his coffee, watching Brenda retreat down the sidewalk, Marcus understood something chilling. The real battle had just begun. The sting of humiliation lingered far longer than the shock of the current. Brenda spent the rest of that day replaying the scene in her head. The sparks, the stumble, the way Marcus didn't even flinch as she flailed against his fence. To her, it wasn't just an accident. It was a deliberate insult, a challenge to her authority as the neighborhood's self-proclaimed enforcer. And if there was one thing Brenda couldn't tolerate, it was the idea of losing control. By the next HOA meeting, the story had already spread like wildfire. Brenda twisted the details to her advantage. She stood at the front of the community clubhouse, dramatizing her ordeal with a shaking hand pressed against her chest. She described Marcus as aggressive, dangerous, and a threat to the safety of every family in the neighborhood. She painted his electrified fence as a deadly trap, designed not for animals, but for innocent residents. And while some neighbors exchanged doubtful glances, others nodded in blind agreement. The HOA board, already tired of Marcus's defiance, seized the opportunity. They issued him an official violation notice, citing hazardous modifications to his property. They threatened daily fines until he dismantled the system. They even hinted at potential legal action, claiming the fence posed a liability to the entire association. Marcus received the letter in his mailbox 2 days later. He read it slowly, letting each line sink in. It was written in cold, bureaucratic language, filled with legal-sounding threats but little actual substance. He knew it was bluster. He knew they were bluffing, but he also knew this was no longer about paperwork. It was about pride. On his porch that evening, Marcus reflected on the pattern. Every time the HOA lost ground, they retaliated harder. Every time Brenda failed to humiliate him, she doubled down. The letter was just another attempt to push him into compliance. But Marcus had something the HOA didn't: proof. He had cameras installed around his property. They had recorded every trespass, every climb, every time Brenda had ignored his boundaries. Instead of tearing down his fence, Marcus prepared. He saved the video files, organized the timestamps, and documented everything. He wasn't just going to defend himself. He was going to turn their crusade against them. Meanwhile, Brenda escalated her campaign. She gathered her closest allies in the HOA patrol, going door to door, whispering warnings about Marcus. She painted him as a menace, claiming he had booby-trapped his home. Some neighbors grew uneasy, avoiding him when they passed by. Others, though, began to see through the charade. They remembered how often Brenda nitpicked over meaningless rules, how many times she had singled people out. Quietly, they started rooting for Marcus, but Brenda wasn't done. One evening, as Marcus sat on his porch, he saw the patrol again. Brenda wasn't alone this time. She had brought 2 other board members, armed with cameras and clipboards. They marched up to his property line, pointing at the fence, taking photos, muttering about evidence. And then it happened. Brenda, determined to prove her point, reached for the fence again. This time Marcus hadn't even flipped the switch, but when she touched it, she jerked her hand back, pretending as though she had been shocked. She clutched her wrist dramatically, calling out to her companions that she had been attacked again. They rushed to her side, snapping more photos, whispering about calling the police. Marcus leaned back in his chair, watching it unfold. He knew what Brenda was doing. She was staging the scene, manufacturing outrage, trying to build a case. But what she didn't realize was that his cameras had caught everything. The untouched switch, the unpowered fence, the way she faked her stumble. He let her continue, saying nothing, his coffee cup steady in his hand. Because the more rope she gave herself, the easier it would be when the time came to pull the rug out from under her. That night, as the patrol scurried back to the clubhouse to write up their incident report, Marcus uploaded the footage to a secure drive. He labeled it carefully, storing copies in multiple places. For now, he would wait. Let them think they were winning. Let Brenda believe she had finally cornered him, because Marcus knew something the HOA didn't. The truth always has a way of burning brighter than the lies, and when the time came, he would let the whole neighborhood watch the flames. The report Brenda filed with the HOA was everything she wanted it to be, emotional, dramatic, and laced with accusations. She described Marcus's fence as a weaponized death trap. She painted herself as a victim of his aggression, claiming she had narrowly avoided serious injury. Her allies on the board backed her without hesitation, voting unanimously to escalate the matter. By the end of the week, Brenda had made her boldest move yet. She called the police. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when Marcus first noticed the patrol car creeping down his street. The blue and white cruiser slowed in front of his house, the officer inside scanning the property. Moments later, the car pulled into his driveway. The door opened and an officer stepped out, clipboard in, hand radio on his shoulder crackling faintly. Brenda wasn't far behind. She strutted up the sidewalk with two HOA board members, her expression smug and triumphant. From his porch, Marcus could feel the weight of the setup. She had orchestrated this moment, convinced it would finally break him. The officer approached. With measured steps, he gestured toward the fence, asking questions Marcus couldn't yet hear. Brenda was quick to interject, waving her arms, pointing to the metal framework, clutching her wrist as if it still throbbed from the shock. The two board members nodded vigorously, adding to the performance. Marcus remained seated. He didn't flinch. He didn't rush down to defend himself. He knew patience was his greatest weapon. Instead, he waited until the officer turned toward the porch, clipboard ready. That was when Marcus finally stood, slow and deliberate, his calmness in stark contrast to Brenda's frantic energy. The officer explained the complaint: a dangerous, electrified fence, a neighbor injured, possible violations of local safety codes. He asked if Marcus would turn off the system so it could be inspected. Marcus smiled faintly. He invited the officer to step onto the porch, then reached inside his pocket for a small remote. With a single click, he flipped the hidden switch. The faint hum that sometimes radiated from the fence silenced completely. The officer walked cautiously to the gate, pulled a small testing device from his belt, and pressed it to the metal. Nothing. No current, no sparks, no danger. Brenda's eyes widened. She rushed forward, demanding that he try again, insisting it must be intermittent. The officer ignored her, running the test a second time, then a third. Still nothing. Marcus let the silence hang heavy before speaking. He explained calmly that the fence was legal, inspected, and safe. He produced the city permit from a neat folder he had prepared in advance. He also mentioned, just casually, that his property was under 24-hour video surveillance. The officer glanced at him, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Marcus said no more, only offered the officer a USB drive with select footage of Brenda climbing his fence weeks earlier, trespassing without permission. The tide began to shift. The officer stepped aside to review the evidence. On the screen, Brenda could be seen pulling herself over the fence, ignoring the clear private property sign, storming across Marcus's yard with that same indignant scowl. The date and timestamp glowed at the bottom of the footage, leaving no room for doubt. The smugness drained from her face. She stammered, insisting the video was out of context. She claimed Marcus had doctored the footage. She even suggested that he had set traps specifically to frame her. But her voice cracked under the weight of her own exaggerations. Officer closed his clipboard, his tone firm but polite. He told Brenda that trespassing was a serious matter and warned her to avoid Marcus's property in the future. He turned back to Marcus, nodded, and left without issuing a citation, without filing a charge. The patrol car pulled away. Brenda was left standing at the curb, her cheeks flushed with fury, her hands trembling with rage. The board members who had followed her looked less confident now, their eyes darting between her and Marcus. From his porch, Marcus sat back down in his chair, lifted his coffee cup, and took a slow, deliberate sip. He didn't need to say a word. His silence spoke louder than anything Brenda could muster, but he knew it wouldn't end here. Brenda had just been publicly embarrassed, again, and people like her didn't fade quietly into the background. If anything, this confrontation had only poured gasoline onto the fire. The HOA wasn't retreating. They were regrouping, and Marcus knew the next move would be bigger, louder, and far more desperate. When humiliation wasn't enough to stop her, Brenda turned to the last weapon she believed would force Marcus to bend: the law. The morning after, the police left Marcus's property without issuing so much as a warning. Brenda stormed into the HOA office, her frustration spilling over into every word. She demanded action. She ranted about liability, about dangerous modifications, about how Marcus's fence threatened the very fabric of their neighborhood's safety. By the time she was finished, the board, wearied by her persistence and eager to protect their own authority, had agreed the HOA would sue. The legal complaint was drafted swiftly, filled with dramatic language about public endangerment and reckless disregard for community standards. Brenda's fingerprints were all over it, but the board signed their names without hesitation. They believed Marcus wouldn't risk the financial burden of a drawn-out battle. They believed he would fold, but Marcus didn't fold. He prepared. When the notice of the lawsuit arrived at his door, Marcus read every line with calm detachment. The accusations were thin, built on exaggerations and outright lies. What Brenda and the board hadn't considered was that Marcus had spent his entire career working in compliance and safety consulting. He knew regulations better than most of the attorneys they could hire, and more importantly, he had proof, video, permits, documentation, evidence that painted a very different picture from the one Brenda had created. Marcus hired a lawyer of his own, not out of desperation, but out of strategy. Together, they crafted a counterattack. Every claim the HOA made was met with hard evidence: city permits signed and dated, inspection reports confirming the fence's legality, time-stamped footage of Brenda trespassing, photographs of her staging injuries that never existed. The counterclaim turned the tables, accusing the HOA of harassment, defamation, and abuse of authority. When the day of the preliminary hearing arrived, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Brenda sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed in her stiffest blazer, her chin lifted with brittle confidence. The board members flanked her, their faces tight with nerves. Across from them, Marcus sat quietly beside his attorney, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Brenda's barely concealed rage. The judge listened as the HOA's lawyer presented their case, leaning heavily on Brenda's testimony. She described the fence as an electrified weapon, claimed she had been severely injured, and insisted that Marcus posed a threat to every child in the neighborhood. Her words echoed through the courtroom, dramatic and emotional, but then it was Marcus's turn. His lawyer stood and methodically dismantled each claim. He presented the official city permit, signed by inspectors, showing the fence met every regulation. He played video clips, clear, irrefutable, showing Brenda trespassing, climbing the fence willingly, and staging her dramatic shock with the system completely powered off. The judge leaned forward, watching closely, his brow furrowed. By the time the defense rested, the narrative had flipped. The courtroom no longer saw Marcus as a reckless homeowner. They saw him as a man targeted by a relentless campaign of harassment. They saw Brenda for what she was, a woman so consumed by her need for control that she had crossed every boundary, legal and moral. The judge didn't dismiss the case outright. Procedures had to be followed, but his comments were sharp. He warned the HOA that their claims were weak, that trespassing was a serious offense, and that wasting the court's time with baseless accusations would not end well for them. He ordered both parties back for a full hearing, but the undertone was clear. The HOA had overplayed its hand. As Marcus left the courthouse, Brenda's eyes followed him with a venomous glare. She had thought this would be her moment of victory, her ultimate humiliation of the man who defied her. Instead, she had been exposed. Again. But Marcus knew the battle wasn't over. Brenda wasn't the type to accept defeat, even when cornered by facts. If the courtroom didn't give her the victory she craved, she would find another stage. And in her desperation, Marcus suspected she would make a mistake so reckless, so public, that even the HOA board wouldn't be able to protect her anymore. The war was entering its final act. Brenda's obsession had grown into something darker than HOA politics. The courtroom setback, the police dismissal, the sting of public embarrassment, each one ate at her pride like acid. To the board, she still wore her mask of authority, insisting that the HOA had the upper hand. But behind closed doors, her frustration festered into desperation. Marcus became her fixation. Every morning, she drove past his home, glaring at the fence as though it mocked her. Every night, she replayed the courtroom humiliation in her mind, the judge's warning echoing louder than she could bear. She couldn't allow the story to end with her as the villain. She needed a final act, a way to prove she was right no matter what it cost. That breaking point arrived one humid summer night. The neighborhood was still, the air heavy with the chirp of crickets. Most residents had retreated to the comfort of their air-conditioned homes, but Brenda lingered outside, parked a few streets away, her headlights off. She wore gloves, a dark jacket, and carried a flashlight she had wrapped in tape to dim the beam. She didn't tell anyone on the board where she was going. This was personal. At midnight, she approached Marcus's property. The fence loomed in the moonlight, its steel frame reflecting pale silver. She pulled herself to the edge, muttering under her breath about safety hazards and illegal modifications. Her plan was reckless but clear. She would catch Marcus in the act of wrongdoing. If she could record evidence, any evidence, of him tampering with the system or threatening the neighborhood, she could spin the narrative back in her favor. What she didn't know was that Marcus had anticipated her. The cameras around his property were motion-activated, their lenses hidden discreetly beneath porch eaves and garden fixtures. The moment Brenda stepped into the yard, they came alive, capturing her every movement in crisp, high definition. Marcus himself was awake. He had grown accustomed to Brenda's patterns, her restless pacing outside his home, her late-night drives past his property. That night, he sat on his porch in the shadows, silent, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. He didn't need to intervene. He only needed to watch. Brenda crept closer to the fence, fumbling with her flashlight, her frustration mounting when nothing dangerous happened. She kicked at the gate, jiggled the latch, muttered angrily when no sparks appeared. She wanted a show, a dramatic moment she could capture on her phone and present as proof. Instead, all she revealed was her own trespass. Then, in her frenzy, she made her mistake. Brenda pulled a pair of wire cutters from her jacket pocket and began snipping at the connections along the side of the fence. Sparks flickered, not from electricity but from metal scraping metal. The cameras caught everything, her tools, her sabotage, her intent. She wasn't documenting danger, she was creating it. From his porch, Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression calm, almost weary. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Not revenge, not retaliation, but proof so undeniable that even Brenda's allies would have to face the truth. She worked for nearly 15 minutes, convinced she was dismantling his illegal system. When she finally stepped back, satisfied with her sabotage, she pulled out her phone and began recording herself, narrating a frantic monologue about Marcus's dangerous modifications. She waved her flashlight toward the fence, her voice rising in indignation. What she didn't notice was the faint red glow of the camera lights tracking her every move. By the time she scurried back into the night, Marcus had everything he needed. He collected the footage, reviewed it carefully, and stored it on multiple drives. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the undeniable evidence that Brenda had not only trespassed, but committed property damage and staged false claims. The next morning, as the sun rose over the quiet neighborhood, Brenda awoke with the smug confidence of someone who believed she had regained the upper hand. She began drafting her next HOA report, already rehearsing the outrage she would unleash at the upcoming meeting. But Marcus sat on his porch with a different kind of confidence. His coffee was warm, his folder of evidence thicker than ever, his patience sharper than Brenda's fury. He didn't need to imagine how this would end anymore. He knew, and when the time came, Brenda's downfall would be written not by her words, but by her own actions, captured in perfect clarity. The morning of the HOA's monthly meeting arrived heavy with tension. For weeks, the neighborhood had buzzed with whispers about Marcus's fence, the police visit, and the lawsuit. Rumors spread in every direction. Some painted Marcus as reckless, others painted Brenda as a tyrant. But what no one yet knew was that the truth was about to be laid bare in front of them all. The clubhouse filled quickly. Neighbors shuffled into folding chairs, their faces expectant, some curious, others weary of the ongoing drama. The board members took their seats at the long table up front, their expressions guarded. And in the center, as always, sat Brenda. Her shoulders were squared, her chin high, her mouth set in a thin line of manufactured authority. Marcus arrived quietly. He didn't storm in with bravado, nor did he look cowed. He simply carried a slim laptop bag and a folder tucked under his arm. He greeted no one, acknowledged no one. His presence alone was enough to hush the room. The meeting began with routine announcements. But the real moment arrived when Brenda seized the floor. She rose dramatically, clutching her stack of papers, and launched into yet another tirade. Her voice trembled with self-righteous fury as she accused Marcus of endangering children, violating safety codes, and creating a hostile living environment. She waved her arms, invoking her supposed injuries, her fear, her indignation. For a few minutes, she commanded the room, but then Marcus stood. He moved slowly, deliberately to the projector at the side of the room. Without raising his voice, without matching Brenda's theatrics, he announced that he had prepared evidence in response to the allegations. A few board members shifted uncomfortably, but no one stopped him. The lights dimmed. The first video appeared on the screen. There was Brenda climbing his fence weeks earlier, ignoring the posted signs, storming across his yard. The room murmured. The second clip rolled. Brenda staging her dramatic shock, clutching her hand when the system wasn't even active. The murmurs grew louder. Then came the final video, the one from that humid summer night. The footage showed Brenda dressed in dark clothing, creeping onto Marcus's property under cover of darkness. It showed her pulling wire cutters from her jacket, damaging his fence, muttering angrily as she staged her own narrative. And then, the most damning moment, her recording herself, declaring Marcus's system dangerous while standing knee-deep in her own sabotage. Gasps rippled through the room. Board members shifted in their seats, their expressions falling into shame and disbelief. Neighbors whispered fiercely, some shaking their heads, others staring at Brenda with open contempt. Brenda's face drained of color. She stammered, tried to shout over the noise, claimed the videos were fake, edited, were taken out of context. But the evidence was too clear, too precise, too undeniable. Every timestamp, every camera angle, every detail pointed to the same truth. She had lied, trespassed, staged, and harassed. The board chair finally raised his hand for silence. His voice was firm, almost trembling with the weight of the decision. He announced that the board could no longer support Brenda's actions, that her behavior had endangered not only Marcus, but the reputation of the entire association. Effective. Immediately, she was removed from her patrol duties and stripped of her position. The board promised to review Marcus's counterclaims seriously and issue a formal apology for their role in the harassment. The room erupted, not with applause, but with the quiet, satisfied murmurs of neighbors who had seen justice unfold in real time. Brenda sat frozen, her papers trembling in her hands, her reign of authority collapsing in a single moment. Marcus closed his laptop, gathered his folder, and walked out without another word. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to look back. The truth had spoken for him. Back on his porch that evening, the neighborhood was silent once again. His fence stood tall, intact, and his garden glowed softly under the porch light. Marcus leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee, the quiet no longer heavy with tension, but filled with something else. Peace. For the first time in months, he felt the weight lift. Not because the fight had been easy, but because he had refused to surrender to lies. His patience, his preparation, his quiet defiance had carried him through. Brenda's downfall wasn't his victory. It was her own doing. She had crossed the line again and again, until the evidence buried her, and in the end, Marcus hadn't needed to shout, to rage, or to fight fire with fire. He had only needed to sit on his porch, watch carefully, and let the truth do the work. The battle with the HOA was over, and Marcus had won.